I'll start in English right off. Please help me to welcome Aminatta Forna to Zagreb and to Booksi. Aminatta, I'm really glad that you're here. We've been emailing each other for 4 years now. And I will just present you a bit. Today, Aminatta had a lecture at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and she talked to the students. I had to present her, and I said that she was a presenter's nightmare. She has done so much that you always drop something out. But I'll try to mention her books. The latest one, Happiness, which is translated into Bosnian, and you will be able to buy it next week at Interliber, is a novel shortlisted for Ondaatje Prize, Jalak Prize, and the European Prize for Fiction. She also wrote 3 other novels, The Hired Man, that takes place in Croatia, and I imagine you might be interested in that as well. The Memory of Love and Ancestor Stones. Ancestor Stones was translated in Serbian, The Hired Man in Slovenian, and none of the books were translated into Croatian. And her first book is Devil That Danced on the Water, her memoir or memories of her father and her family life. Her novels were, or her books were translated into more than 20 languages, I believe. She also has published essays for various journals and magazines, and newspapers, The Guardian, The Observer, the New York Review of Books. She's director currently of a Lennon Center for Poetics and Social Practice at Georgetown University in Washington. Otherwise, she's of British, Scottish origin and Sierra Leonean origin, and she has lived all over the world. So mostly, I would say, legally resident of Great Britain or the UK, but all over. And one also interesting thing about her career and her, Aminatta studied law. She started as a journalist. She worked for BBC for a long time. She also did documentary films, and she acted or has acted as a member of numerous juries for literary prizes. Currently, she's on Giller Prize this year, a member of the jury, and she also runs a charity that is dedicated to education in Sierra Leone, and particularly she's committed to education of girls. So these are all, and I didn't mention everything, I dropped something out, I'm sure. Yeah, she's the fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, for example. But Aminatta is really a character of its own, almost a character from a novel. Thank you again for coming here, and maybe just to start off, you're pretty young, and when I mention all these, when I list all these, how does your how does your year look like? Not every day, and yeah, Aminatta is a mother and she has a family as well. How does your year look like? I mean, how much do you travel? How much do you stay at home? What does it look like?
Hello, and lovely to see you all here. I'm very excited by this. How does my year look? What was I going to say? No, one of the reasons I appear to have done so many things is because I was quite bad at a lot of them. So, I was supposed to become a lawyer, but I showed a sufficiency of aptitude, I think, but very little desire. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer, and, because I came from a certain generation of my West African father. For him, there were just two career choices. It was doctor or lawyer, which one do you want? I started on law and I realised this was just never going to happen. So I got my degree, then I became a journalist, which was when I started, first of all, reporting, and then I became a documentary maker. And I was good enough at it, but, I had not found my chosen path. I was very, very frustrated by a lot of the constraints of reporting and of lesser documentary making, that too. So really, I appear to have done so much because it took me quite a while to find my path. Although I always said that I wanted to be a novelist at the very beginning, and everybody around me tried to talk me out of it. My teachers tried to talk me out of it, my parents tried to talk me out of it. So it sort of took me a while to get back to where I wish to be, which is why I appear to have done quite so many things. But now that I'm here, I have been a novelist for the last 20 years, and I'm extremely happy in that place. Except for, and to get to your question, the things that take me away from it. I do a lot of travel. Some aspects are, just part of the job, and when a book comes out, I have to do a great deal of promotion. And then there are other things I do. And I wrote to somebody about the fact I was in Croatia, and they said, "What are you doing there?" And I said, "No, this one's for love." This one is for love. Sometimes it's for money, but this one is for love. But a writer's life now, increasingly, with the way in which, writing and publishing has become an international industry, requires us to leave home a great deal.
When you mentioned Croatia, this is your fourth time? Fifth time in Croatia. So maybe you can tell us about your first time.
My very first time. Now, so she said how young I was. When I said that the first time I ever came to Croatia was 1969, you will know that I'm not that young. I first came in 1969. I was 5 years old. My mother had just divorced my father and married a diplomat, and he brought her and her children, she had three children, to Dubrovnik. It was part of they were sort of doing a grand honeymoon, and at some point they decided that they would pick us up and bring us with them. So actually that 1969 was my first ever visit to this country. It took me a few years to get back, but that was the start.
The reason I'm asking about this is that your novels feature a lot of characters from all parts of the world. They take place in different parts of the world, and you are one of those writers that feel really at home in the world. I can't really pin you down to any specific geography, and you seem to be very confident, but also very comfortable in different geographies and different settings. Can you tell us a bit about it?
I'll tell you a little bit about my family. So my father's from Sierra Leoneu, or was from Sierra Leoneu, he's dead now. My mother's Scottish. They met at a particular period of history, which was the end of empire, the end of the British Empire. And my father was very much a pro-independence activist, and he was in Britain studying, and he met my mother. So, in a way, they were all, my father was always somebody who was incredibly outward-looking, and my mother was somebody who was incredibly adventurous. I've written a great deal about my father for the reason that he died young. He was killed when I was 11. And for the reason also that Sierra Leone has been through very many political struggles. And I have written much less about my mother, much to her annoyance. But I am making up for it. And you know, so recently I took my mother on a trip to Scotland, and we went back to where her family came from originally, which is the Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands, and I've written a piece about that. But you know, I think my mother and father were already transnational in their outlook, right? Before I came along, they were already people of the world. My mother grew up in a white working class Scottish family. But when, for this essay, I asked her to list all the countries she'd lived in and all the countries she travelled to, I realised that I just could not. I had to put a note at the end of the essay because the list was so long. So I grew up with people like that. I grew up with people who were already adventurous. They were going to break boundaries. They were going to marry each other across cultures. My mother was willing to go and live in West Africa at the age of 21. You know, my father saw his career very much on a global scale. So you know, those are people who raised me, and I think that's who made me. I think that's the bottom line. Then I'll tell you about the next generation. So then they had 3 kids, and then my mother had another son after, with her second husband. I start with my elder brother. Then my mother married first a Sierra Leonean, then a New Zealander, then a Canadian. My brother married first an Iranian woman, then a Danish woman. My sister's married to a Jamaican woman. I'm married to a British man. And my younger brother is married to a Chinese woman and lives in Hong Kong and speaks perfect Mandarin. And his son, who's the same age as my son, so I now live in America for the present. I teach at Georgetown, so my son now speaks with an American accent, and his first cousin speaks perfect Mandarin and he won some kids award for reciting poetry in Mandarin or something. So, you know, so it's funny that in the same family, you know, we're not even generations apart. We are all siblings. We have that kind of global scale. So I think it has arisen out of that, and so when I was writing about my mother, and the ability that we all have to traverse into other cultures and countries. And I was what I compare it to is being bilingual. So, I mean, a lot of you speak extremely good English, don't you? And possibly some of you are bilingual. I'm not bilingual, in fact, but this is the analogy comparison I'm going to make. So bilingual people sometimes forget which language they're speaking or thinking in, right? And sometimes they dream in different languages. And I think there comes a facility with culture where you begin to realise that there are patterns. So that the way that people who can speak a lot of languages, you hear about someone who can speak 8 languages, and what you discover is that that person's brain has simply begun to recognise patterns of language. And in fact, one of the measures, the British Foreign Service now, when they recruit diplomats, they don't ask you how many languages you speak, they test your ability to learn languages. And they figure out that if you've got that ability, they can teach you anything in half an hour, and off you go. So it's about recognising patterns, and so I feel comfortable in so many places. I feel, you know, more comfortable in some places and less comfortable in other places, depending quite often on how people are treating me. But it's to do with the fact that I've begun to see patterns of culture and patterns of how people respond to each other in civilizations, and they're not that different. Right? They're not that different. But I'm generally, not perfectly, but you know, significantly more than many people I know, attuned to how a place thinks and functions. I don't get scared.
We have been talking lately a lot about intercultural dialogue. But reading your novels, different characters come from different parts of the world, and they manage somehow, and from different cultures, and they manage somehow to have a dialogue. But the people who are left out, the people who don't have any dialogue, are the people who stay at home. And the one who feel the most displaced are the ones who stay put. Can you?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think we now find ourselves at a place in the world where the people who, I mean, your word is displaced, but they feel displaced in their own home because everything around them has changed. And but it was ever thus. I mean, you know, the world has always been changing in different ways, and some people are more adaptable to change than other people are. And I think that the big myth that we're sold is that the world didn't change, and you know, that change is very recent. I'll tell you something I did recently. When you were introducing me, I was thinking about this. I did a DNA test. You know those things you can get? So I was, what was I doing? I was too long to tell you, but I was thinking of writing something about white nationalists, because you know white nationalists in America keep taking their DNA tests and then they find out they're not that white. And then they get really upset. So I was thinking of writing about that. I abandoned the idea, but while I was on it, my husband came home and said, "Oh look, you know, these tests are discounted online. Do you want me to get you one?" So I went, "I know what I have." And then I said, "No, get me one, because it would be a good piece in the essay, right?" Yeah. So I did my DNA test. Now, it still wasn't a surprise, but it does show you how much the world is not changing, right? The change is not new. I'm not Sierra Leonean. I'm actually half Malian. 48% Mali, 1% Senegalese, 1% Ghana on my African side. So, and this actually corresponded exactly with the oral history of the family. When I researched the oral history of my family years back when I was writing my memoir, the eldest aunt who had the history of the family memorized, she said, "We came from Mali." She said, "We originally came from Fouta Djallon, and we were horsemen, and we came from Mali." And that turned out, in terms of my DNA, to be absolutely accurate. And then the other thing was that the Scottish DNA, Viking. Not that Scottish at all. So, you know, I correspond, that part of my DNA corresponds exactly to the islanders. And the islanders all know that they are, you know, mostly Viking and you know, Norwegian, but so it's kind of interesting that, you know, however far back you go, people have always moved. Right, they've always moved and they've always migrated. So, what was the question? Oh yeah, the people who stayed. So the really interesting thing about going to the Scottish Islands is that everybody there, they are completely used to this idea of migration, right? Because everybody leaves. Everyone leaves the Scottish Islands, and some people come back, and they know their history, and they know there's been this ebb and flow, that they belong to Scotland, then they belong to Denmark, you know, they know that Vikings founded certain places on the island. So it was kind of really interesting that the air around this issue of migration is completely different. And the people who I spoke to who live on the island simply took it as it was their choice to stay, and that's where they feel happy, but they also are comfortable in things changing around them. Whereas for, you know, when I think of my Scottish grandmother is the only person I know who tried to emigrate and failed. She left Scotland and she went to Canada, as did most of her family. Her uncles and aunts and cousins all migrated to Canada at a time when you were paid to go. So, you know, this thing called assisted migration, because Canada needed people and Britain still had its empire thing going. So she went, and she lasted for 2 years. And if you look at the point of her departure and the point of her return, she returns on the first day that she could get back to Scotland without having to repay the money that she had taken. So it was just like, I'm out of here. And you know, that she didn't just never leave Scotland. She never left her city, she never left her neighbourhood, and after a little bit, she never left the house either. You know, she was absolutely somebody who was uncomfortable with difference. And then you compare her to her daughter, who reaches the age of 18, it's like, I'm out of here. So I honestly think that part of it is temperament. You know, there's history and culture and all kinds of things that make us feel comfortable in the space we are. And then I think on top of it, there's a temperament is a big part of it.
To go to your novels, today when you were talking to the students, you said that when you teach creative writing, which you do, you tell them not to write about things that they know, but the things they want to understand. Can you say why? I mean, most of the students of creative writing get advice to write about themselves or about what they know, and you offer completely opposite advice.
Right, I didn't want to have to read 20 stories about getting drunk on the weekend at a student party. I think that's mostly why I said it. Well, my approach to literature is that the whole project of literature is to try to understand things beyond ourselves. And one of the things I tell my students that don't write about what you know, write about what you want to understand. Partly because the process of writing is such a long inquiry. Right? I mean, it took me 3 or 4 years to write my last novel. The inquiry is so long that if you don't have, the project is so long that if you don't have a driving force, and for me that driving force is curiosity. And I think it is for most people. I think the reason most people keep going with things, sometimes bad relationships, is curiosity. So that's a big part of it. But also, I do believe that the whole project of fiction is about understanding other people. So one of the things I do with my students very early on is I ask them to write about character, and I deliberately give them images of people who look very different from them. And I ask them to imagine, they have to do an exercise, and the exercise is simply that person coming home. Right? Write me 2 paragraphs of what this person does when they come home. And it flips them quite quickly out of this, amazingly quickly actually, out of this mindset of constantly writing about the self. And it's taken me a while to find ways to break people out of doing that, out of writing this sort of autobiographical or semi-autobiographical work. But it's about getting them to look at what's just the same about somebody else and what might be different. So somebody most of us do much the same thing when we come home, don't we? We do much the same thing. We take off our coat, I don't know, pat the dog, say hello. Oh, everyone that I know goes straight to the kitchen. Everybody goes straight to the kitchen. If just to stick your head in the fridge and figure it out. So it puts them into this place of realising in what ways we are mostly the same, but in what ways some things might subtly be different. And they do it remarkably well. And almost after they've done that, there's no going back. After they've done that, the stories they start to produce don't just all feature 19-year-old Americans.
But when you write about something you don't know, you have to research a lot. And you're known to be a great researcher when it comes to your novels. Yeah. I was wondering, writing about, just to mention The Hired Man, writing about a completely unknown country to you, even though you were here when you were 5, or you had been here when you were 5, writing about a completely different country that speaks a different language. The Hired Man is an extremely well-researched book. So when I read it, I was really shocked about the level of detail of the popular culture, of the foods, of anything that was. So that took a lot of time, I guess. My question would be, why is that research so important for you? I'm sure that a novel could be written without all that type of detail.
What different kind of novel could
yes. Be? And maybe you could share with us the most bizarre or the most interesting things that you had to do for research.
Well, when I say write, I say write about what you want to understand as opposed to write what you don't know. I would really love to have a mathematician in a book of mine, but I'm so bad at maths that I know this is never going to happen. You know, I'm never going to get my head across. So, you know, you can't set your goals too far away from where you are. But it seemed to me, and it still seems to me, that although, you know, I don't speak literally the same language as people in Croatia, that we speak the same language in that there was a very strong similarity of history between Sierra Leone and Croatia. So I had chosen to write a set of story in the Balkans because the two civil conflicts were contemporaneous, Sierra Leone and the Croatian. They were almost exactly contemporaneous. Ours went on longer, till 2002, and here it ended in 1995. But they've been happening at the same time. And I was reading about them in the papers in Britain at the same time, but the reporting was completely different. Right? The reporting of the conflict here was given in long and detailed accounts. The reporting of the war in Sierra Leone was, oh, here we go, Africans at it again. Ours was characterised as ethnic, which it wasn't. You know, so, you know, I'd already kind of become drawn to the fact that we had had this experience. I had Croatian and Bosnian friends in Britain who I spent a lot of time with, and I remember very clearly one New Year. They have a New Year party every year. One New Year, I had brought some Sierra Leonean friends who were actually basically straight off the plane, and we had all gone to this party with the Croatian friends, and at the end of the party, you know, at 1, 2, 3 in the morning, we were just sitting down talking about our experience of war. And the people in the room who couldn't take part were the British friends because they had no similar encounter. So, you know, I was drawn to write about a war that wasn't exactly mine, but that was very similar in many ways, and to think about the ways in which it was similar and the ways in which it was different. But also specifically, because, you know, if and when you manage to read The Hired Man, there's a character in it who's British, and she's called Laura, and she knows but does not wish to know about what has happened. She comes to Croatia, she buys a holiday home, and actually the absolute impetus for setting the story here was when I opened a newspaper in Britain at the beginning near, I don't know, 2003, 4, 5, maybe even later, 6, 7, and there was an advert for cheap holiday houses in Croatia and in Bosnia. And I thought, wow, what does that mean? What does it mean? Are these empty houses being sold? Or wouldn't you ask? Wouldn't you want to know what the provenance of that house was if you were going to buy? And the idea that the aftermath of a war had become an opportunity for cheap real estate was deeply troubling. But also the idea, you know, that British people would go to Croatia and buy a house, but by goodness, would you find them buying a house in Sierra Leone? No. They'd stay terrified. So, you know, I was interested in doing all of that. So the two main characters in the book are Laura, the British woman who goes to Croatia and buys a holiday home, and Duro, who is the local handyman whom she hires to fix up the house, but who knows what the history of the house is. So you have these two characters. And I would say that they were in conversation, except that Laura doesn't do conversation. She's a completely blinkered human being who never wishes to look at what might inconvenience her, right? She never wants to look at anything that might inconvenience her about the world and might stand in her way of getting what she wants. So I was really examining that kind of chosen ignorance, you know, that choice to remain ignorant about something. And Laura has a daughter called Grace, and Grace is temperamentally completely different from her mother. She has an inquiring mind. And Grace begins to see that there is something about this place that, you know, suggests a different past. And actually the whole book is written in Duro's voice. So you see them through his eyes the whole way through the novel.
And when you say you see them through their eyes, I was kind of hoping that you would tell us the anecdote about you shooting the rifle.
Oh yeah.
Because the Juro, or I would call him Juro, even though he's Duro in the book, but he's the sniper guy. So he looks through the sniper, how do you call this?
Are you getting with the scope?
The scope. And the whole novel is written.
Yeah, through that.
Through that.
Very, very narrow lens. Yeah. So the research, I did several things, of course. I spent time in the area, and I had my Croatian friends who helped me. I remember that you asked this question, so I'll get it done quickly. I spent time in the area, but I had these two Croatian friends who helped me with it. And one of them helped me the whole way through the book. I would ring up and say, in the 1970s when you were growing up, what movies did you watch? Your mother, when you were ill, what did she make you? And then the other one read the book, they both read it when it was finished and went through it and helped me with some details. And they were both people who worked in theatre. And theatre people are incredibly useful because they understand the whole mise en scène, they understand setting and character and props. So they were very, very helpful on a sort of practical basis. But there were ways in which I had to inhabit Duro's world. And, one of the things that sort of prompted me into writing about this part of about your conflict is I had not understood why the conflict here seemed to start so quickly, whereas the conflict in Sierra Leone had taken so long. And nobody I spoke to seemed to even recognise this as a question. And I said, no, but Sierra Leone went through decades and decades and decades before the first flare. And then a friend of mine who had been a war correspondent, and he had reported both in Sierra Leone and here, he had said to me, almost in passing, he said, well, the reason that war took off so fast was because it's a hunting culture, and every man has a gun, and every man knows how to use one. And then you add on that the fact that there had been national service here. So, here it was possible to raise a trained army much quicker, or a militia much faster than it was in Sierra Leone, where people were subsistence farmers and had access to nothing but a cutlass, a scythe. And it's kind of interesting when you look at what became emblematic of both wars. Throughout the Balkan War, it was the sniper and his rifle, and the empty house. And the Sierra Leonean War, it was the amputated wrist, amputated hand, and that was because people when they go to war, they pick up the first thing they have, and the first thing farmers have is a scythe. So So then I decided, okay, Jiro is somebody who knows how to use a gun. I mean, he keeps being referred to as a sniper, but he's actually just a regular guy who hunts sometimes, right? Actually, in the book, he's a regular guy who has a small holding, he raises some animals, and he does handyman work, and he, like a lot of people all around the world, hunts, and he hunts for meat. That's what he does. But he knows how to hold a rifle. So at some point in the book, he begins to use that weapon. And I decided that it was important for me to learn to shoot a high velocity rifle in order to figure out the kind of character that Jiro was. And so I'll just tell you one little thing about it. I was an okay shot, it's okay. But the person who taught me, this is in Britain where it's very controlled. I should have just done it in America. But because in Britain where people have to sign off on loads of papers before you can do this. But the person who taught me was a former police marksman. And I told him this is when you research, by the way, I don't know how many of you are writers here want to be thinking of it? Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, if you want to write, ask people, they will tell you, right? So my tutor and I told him, this is this character, this is what he does, and this is what I'm researching. And so this guy helped me all the way along. But anyway, one of the things he said to me was, tell me a story about the American Olympic sharpshooting team. And the story is this, that they brought in a performance coach to try to increase their scores. Now, these are people, frequently, who know nothing about the particular thing they're looking at, right? If it's a soccer team, they don't know that much about soccer. if it's, I don't know, chess, they don't know that much about chess. They're not teaching you how to do the thing. What they're figuring out is, what do you do when you do your best? Right. So they just watch it, right? They just watch the chess player, they just watch the soccer player, and they figure out, when you do your best, what is it you do that makes you do that? And one of the things that they got out of this research with the American sharpshooting team is that they all pulled the trigger between heartbeats. But none of them knew this. So when I came to write Duo, I knew that he had to be somebody of absolute self-control, right? Almost perfect self-control, if that was what it was going to be. And I think that if I hadn't done that research, he would just not have been the same character. You know, the book would have been completely different if I didn't know that this is somebody whose heart beats so slowly that he can master it.
And for happiness, happiness is not, seemingly not about the war, even though can I even say that war is your literary obsession, or civil conflict?
Civil conflict
is your literary obsession.
Yeah.
But happiness seemingly is not about the war. However, the main character in happiness goes from war to war to war. And my question, today you talked to the students about literature and politics. War is always a direct, or civil conflict is always a direct consequence of politics, of some politics. My question would be, what do you think writers' role is with regards to politics? We discussed that a bit today, and the research that you do, the novels that you write, they are never openly political in the sense that they talk about a specific history or a specific causal relations. In The Hired Man, you don't even mention the ethnics. You don't even mention Serbs and Croats. Everything is somehow show, not tell. Everything is, but in that respect, how do you see your role as a writer when it comes to dealing with politics through literature?
Well, you know, I think that writers, Nadine Gordimer says, to show what is really there. So if you read, I remember when I studied history in school, we would do the causes of the First World War, the causes of the Second World War, and there would just be these bullet points of major events that have taken place, you know, the assassination in Sarajevo and this and this and this. I mean, that's fine at a particular level, but you know, there are ways in which people go to war on a minute level, you know, on a not at the level of macro politics, and also, you know, I did leaders hijack. You know, you can say, I don't know, let's say if you're thinking of South Africa, you can indoctrinate people up to a point. You can tell them certain things, you can oblige them to act in a certain way, but actually each person is an individual thinking human being and has a choice about how to respond to that. You know, so I think the role of a writer really is to ask people, if they've been through it, to question it, but what I try to do is I try to get people to walk the walk with my characters. So every step of the way, I ask them to put themselves as in that position and consider the outcomes. When I've done it most directly, it was with a book called The Memory of Love, which was about a man who, it was about the line between complicity, silence and complicity. It's been done before, but it's about the line between silence and complicity. But what I really try to do is take my readers every step of the way, so that if they chose to, they could ask themselves, what would you do here? What would you do there? What would you do there? And they're not big, you know, the questions were never big, they're tiny, tiny moments where he makes certain decisions. And you only ever see it in almost see it in retrospect. It's only when you get to the end of the book you see the cumulative effect of all of those decisions. So I think it's, for me, it's about putting your reader right in the centre of it. It's something that they may, if they are lucky in this world, never experience. But should they experience it, I would like people to have thought about it. And I'll finish off this answer by saying this, that one of the things I was always asked, after The Devil That Danced on the Water, which was a memoir about my father that came out, one of the things that was said to me so often by Western journalists was, well, none of us know how we would respond in that situation. And I just thought, but shouldn't we? Shouldn't we? I mean, we can't know absolutely, but shouldn't we have thought about it? Shouldn't we have some sense of how we would like to respond, even if, you know, when faced with it, our courage fails us? Wouldn't we like to know how? Wouldn't we like to think how we would respond? And I think that's what's informed the politics of my books.
You also, as I mentioned, you kind of go around it. You never deal with history. You deal with the psychology more than with history, and you deal with the trauma, with what consequences do these choices make or leave on people. So in happiness, in a very paradoxical way, you connect trauma to resilience, and you kind of mock Western
fragility.
Well, yeah, naming names or categorization of
labeling.
pathologizing the very basic human emotions in a way, and you in happiness you also in thanks you mentioned Boris Cyrulnik, who was here a few years ago, and his notion of resilience. So maybe you can tell me what is the writer's role in overcoming the trauma, or is there a kind of a closure or analysis or anything that a novel can bring to people or to readers that could, in a way, resonate with the trauma?
So narrative and resilience are very linked. And this is what Boris Cyrulnik and others, but he was one of the leading psychiatrists to talk about this, about the way that narrative is linked to resilience. And you can tell people a story one way, and you can tell them a story a different way. You can put a different texture on the same story and have a different outcome. So what Cyrulnik really opposed was, and what he said was happening with the mental health profession, was that you would have a person, a patient or a client, a person who had been through some trauma, I always call them potentially traumatizing events, and I know that sounds really long-winded, but trauma is not a necessary outcome. Some people suffer trauma and some people don't, and actually most people don't. Trauma is the ensuing damage from the event. So, you know, and it's taken me quite a long time to sort of figure out how I use the language around this, but I make a separation between trauma and suffering. I think suffering is something that we can expect to encounter in life, and trauma is really your response to that suffering, and some people struggle to overcome. And actually, recently I spoke to a psychologist who had been one of the people in America who had got PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, entered into the psychiatric canon, and he worked with Vietnam War veterans. And I said, you know, can you help me to, you know, find a way to express the difference between trauma and suffering? And he said, trauma, he said, most people who go through something terrible will develop if they don't already have them, they'll develop the emotions and tools to overcome it in time. But some people, for various reasons, don't. And people who don't are the ones who are traumatized. So they remain unable to overcome the event. So that's what I mean by this between trauma and suffering. But he's unusual. And this is a debate that's going on in psychiatry, in psychology. It's not something that I came up with yesterday. This is a debate that is ongoing. To what extent do we describe, any bad event in your life as traumatic, or what extent do we say, no, these things are trauma, but these things are just general suffering? What was the question again?
How can a writer, how can a novel or a text or a writer respond to that?
Got it. So, Cyrilnik, what he described in all, so getting back to this one. So what Cyrilnik said was, he himself had survived the Nazi occupation of Paris, and his parents were killed in the death camps, and he had joined the resistance, and as a little kid. And what he said was, it's the narrative in which you frame the event, right? That makes the big difference. And if you look at kids, and a lot of the work is with children, if you look at kids who have resilience, it's because the people around them, whilst acknowledging the suffering, don't compound the suffering by saying, oh, poor you, this is terrible, your life is over. They don't compound it. They acknowledge it, but don't compound it. And that is also contextualized within the wider society. What stories do the people around them? How do they frame it? How does the wider society frame it? And the more negatively the wider society frames it, the worse the outcome. Right? So, before you ask me, we can't just say, oh, it's all fine. That's not what anyone is saying. It's just about having a realistic framework, but one that is not negative. So I think that what novels do, or can do, and that's why I sort of really, I write about trauma a lot, but I try to write it from a different perspective, and not just write this sort of, the kind of depressing trauma novel that, I really try to give it a context which allows readers who haven't suffered anything like that to understand it and engage with it, but it does allow people who have suffered like that some way to understand the narrative of their situation. And narrative is absolutely the key to resilience. I believe it over and over again, and I've seen it happen.
Well, maybe now,
Read a bit.
Yeah, maybe now we could hear a bit from Happiness.
I don't normally read off my iPad, it's just that the books are so big. I'll just read a little bit from the opening, I think. Chapter 1, London, Sunday the 2nd of February 2014, evening. At that time of day, Waterloo Bridge is busy with shoppers and weekend workers who make their way on foot across the bridge to Waterloo Station. At that time of year, too, dusk comes early, by 4 in the afternoon. By 5 it is dark. The fox wended its way through the pedestrians, who, for the most part, paid it no heed, for they would not so easily be distracted from their fixity of purpose. Through the slanting sleet, many people didn't see the fox. Those who did thought it was perhaps a loose dog. A few people had observed the fox on its journey. Upon the terrace of the National Theatre, a pair of smokers had spotted the fox, watching them from behind the corner of a raised concrete flower bed that was filled with dead lavender. The smokers and the fox looked at each other in stillness for several seconds. Then 3 things happened, which caused the fox to bolt. A passing cruiser on the river gave a blast of its horn, which in turn caused one of the smokers to utter a high-pitched "ooh" of surprise. This startled the fox, which backed off and might have done little more than run down the stairs to the next level, had not, third, a plastic bag, dislodged from a tree branch by a sudden gust of wind, borne suddenly down upon the terrace. Moments before all this happened, another smoker had emerged from the theatre lobby and now stood with the heavy door propped upon one shoulder for use as a windshield while she lit a cigarette. The fox, escaping the threat of the carrier bag, dashed through the open door and into the lobby, where it joined the lava flow of departing theatres down the stairs. But down the stairs and through the crowd went the fox, and as it went, it brushed against calves and knees, causing people to hop, exclaim, and search the floor through the thicket of legs for the cause. Down on the ground level, the fox skidded across the hard floor. A young man selling programmes for the evening show pointed and cried there, in a kind of outrage, to a pair of security guards who, with a jangle of keys, lumbered into life. The fox headed for the glass doors leading to the outside. Onlookers stopped to watch. Talk stalled to silence. Between the bank of glass doors and the concrete walls of the building, the fox had nowhere to go. On the other side of the glass, a man, painted top to toe in silver, carrying a silver cane and wearing a silver bowler hat, and who had spent 8 hours standing motionless upon a box in the freezing temperatures of the day, approached the building with no idea of the commotion unfolding beyond. Just as the fox reached the last in the row of doors, the silver man pulled it open. The fox ran out. The security guard skidded to a stop. One nearly fell over. The other uttered an exclamation in Yoruba. Both laughed and adjusted their peaked caps. One clapped his companion upon the shoulder. Some people broke into a scattering of applause, and the silver man took a bow. Outside, the smell in the air was of river water and traffic fumes. The fox ran up the stone steps to the bridge, where it overtook a man carrying a bicycle. On the bridge, the people walked unswervingly, armed with bags, defended by earphones, looking neither right nor left, and acknowledging nothing and nobody. Those who did not walk with purpose meandered in pairs, rocks around which the faster walkers flowed. Past a cameraman taking a time-lapse image of the river, the fox, moving at a metronomic trot, wove a line through them all. A man, so tall he appeared to be wading through the crowd, was crossing the bridge in the opposite direction to the fox. The man's name, the name his mother had given him as though she knew to what size her only son one day would grow, was Attila. In his pocket, Attila carried a theatre ticket. In addition, he held a reservation for one at a restaurant in the Aldwych. He'd chosen the restaurant. He'd chosen the restaurant after reading the menu displayed outside the entrance, and now his reverie was of boiled beef, taffel spits, and chopped chicken salad. Attila was new in the country by no more than a few hours, and he relished for the moment the feel of wind and sleet on his face. He relished too the idea that soon he would sit alone in a dark place surrounded by strangers, where nobody could find him. He moved slowly in the crowd, letting people pass. In the middle of the bridge, just beyond the cameraman standing with his camera on a tripod, Attila came to a stop and turned to admire the view of the Houses of Parliament. Somebody ran into him. The collision left Attila unhurt, a testament to his scale and size. By contrast, the woman who'd run into him was thrown to the ground, and Attila promptly bent to help her up. He apologised in sympathy, but obviously this could not be his fault. The woman accepted his hand, stood up and brushed her backside. She wore jeans and a sweater and jacket, all in black. Attila retrieved a black day pack from the ground and held it out to her, but she left him holding on to it for some moments while she retied her hair into its ponytail. As he waited, Attila noticed two things about the woman. First, that her hair was a rather remarkable pale silver and hung to the middle of her back, or would have done were she not already in the act of pushing it up inside a woolen hat. Secondly, that she was tall for a woman. She nearly reached his chin. The woman put her hand out so Attila might pass her bag, swung it onto her shoulder and said, "I'm so sorry about that, do excuse me," in a way that suggested no particular sorrow at all. Attila nodded. A moment later he watched her walk away, her long strides. He could still feel the force of their collision, the imprint of her body on his.
Thank you.
I'll say something about that. They all come back.
Yeah,
Everybody in that first section.
What I wanted to say, what is magical about this first chapter is that you introduce all the characters in the first chapter. And then this would be my last question before you can ask questions. When we discussed, when you read this and when I listened to this chapter being again, and thinking about all these characters that can go through the book and come together again, I was thinking of what you were talking today to the students about the big P and small p. And the fox is the thing that links them in a way. So maybe you could explain to the audience what the big P and the small p are, the politics and the personal.
Oh,
and
wow. Well, the big P, it takes us back to another book. I wrote a book called Ancestor Stones, which had 4 characters in it who were all women, same family but different generations. So they were born, like a decade apart. It was the family's polygamous and they had different mothers. And depending on which decade each woman was born into, her life was circumscribed by actually the big politics of what was going on. But what I did was I chose women who were pretty much removed from any kind of public life so that they didn't know the way in which their life was being influenced. And this book had come about because when I wrote the memoir of my father, I had written 3 chronologies, one of the country and the main political events in the country in that decade or 2. And then I'd written one of my father's life and all the main events in his life. And then I wrote one of my own life and all the main events of my life, even though I was a kid. And when I put the 3, when I overlaid them one on top of each other, it was completely evident that everything that had happened in his life had been dictated by what was happening at a macro, a big political level. And every event that had happened in my life had been dictated by what was happening in his life, which was, of course, in turn. So in ways that we don't even recognise until you start joining the dots. You see how all these things are connected. So that's what I call the little P's, me, the small political action, but the effect of the big P on me. But then also there's a sort of reverse effect, which is, and I've written about it in other books, the way and I spoke about this earlier, the way in which our small choices eventually kind of add up to create or underline greater political changes. So the fox metaphor in happiness is really the I don't know. People apparently didn't have that many foxes in this city.
There's no foxes here.
London is overrun. So everywhere I go, people say, there are really that many foxes in London? London is overrun with foxes. You see them all the time. Hardly a day goes by when I don't see a couple of foxes. So, and Londoners know this, and Londoners are quite split on it. There are people who don't like the foxes and people who do like the foxes. And the people who do like the foxes send me lots and lots and lots of pictures of them. But the thing about the foxes is recognising that the foxes are there because of our actions. Right? The foxes are there because we do certain things that attract the foxes to live in the city. And one of the things we do, first of all, we build on land that was once occupied by all kinds of creatures. Okay, well that's going to happen. But the second thing is that foxes are attracted by the fact, really by the fact that we drop fast food. We drop so much food on the pavement that all kinds of animals are attracted, but particularly foxes. because foxes can survive so well, they've adapted to survive so well in the urban environment. And that's the sort of what I mean by the little be small p thing with foxes, is we have to recognise our own actions in creating a bigger picture. You know, instead of thinking that somehow this has all come from outside, we're actually all players in the same thing.
Well, this is the time for your questions. Yeah.
Ask me about foxes.
Maybe later. I really want to ask you something, coming back to The Hired Man. When I was reading it, I was really awestruck by how deep your understanding is of what happened to us. And I know you said something about your ability to recognize patterns over cultures and the driving force of your curiosity, and I mean all that. But maybe this is a bit impertinent, so please feel free not to answer. But I really want to ask you whether what happened to your father had an impact in your life, which would actually open up space inside in which you could really personally reach a deeper level of understanding of what loss is, and that is this maybe the place from which you wrote this book?
So I mentioned it earlier on, but my father was murdered when I was 11. He was a political activist, and yeah, I mean, it affected everything in my life. I mean, to lose a parent anyway, you know, would affect anybody, but in those circumstances and at that time, and I think that it's a choice. You know, I know lots of people. Political violence is not unusual in Sierra Leone, was not unusual at that time, and so I know other people who have. I'm not alone, but I think it very much depends on what you choose to make your response to something, and some people close it down and move on. To me, it was very important to understand the causes, and my father had made a very great effort to have us understand. Like, he really did. We always, you know, to the extent that we could, because I really was very young, but he always made it as clear as he could why things were happening and what was important and what was at stake and why we were doing this. So I grew up with that sensibility. And he had already, I mean, and you know, he wrote a letter. Did I mention this time? No, oh, okay, so I'm getting all my talks being all merged. To the students today, I described the fact that he had, or perhaps it was an interview I did an hour ago. Anyway, at some point today, I described the fact that my father, on the day of his death, had left a letter to the nation. He was executed, and he had written a letter to the nation on the day that he was to die, and he'd given it to somebody to hide, and that person hid it for many years, and then eventually it was published. So I was not the only person who understood what his thinking had been. He said in the letter that we would go to war. Right? He laid out the trajectory. He said, if you continue down this path, it will lead to a dictatorship, and it will lead to the end of the rule of law, and it will lead to war. And that's exactly what happened, and the letter was then published in 2000, when the war was not yet concluded, but had been going for many years. So here was this political trajectory, right? And you know, the fact that that's how he, you know, the effect that it had on all of us, but I guess on me in particular, because I was his daughter, and I always understood from him that there are patterns to things and reasons for things, and that you have, if you look for them, you will find them. Right? If you look for the patterns, you will find them. If you look for the connective tissue, the way in which one action leads to another, you will find that. So, yeah, you know, these things are inseparable.
Other questions? Don't be shy.
Yeah, I have one. I'll build on that. So I feel there's been a lot of talk about cellular memory recently, and I think some people call it a pseudoscience. I'm quite interested in that, and I'm wondering if you feel that has in any way your view on it first, and also whether it has impacted your writing in any way or a creative process. And also wondering, you mentioned you have a son, so he clearly hasn't met his grandfather, and whether how you convey the story of your father to your son, and whether you see that as possibly material for your writing.
Could you expand slightly the idea of cellular memory?
The idea that the trauma we carry through the generations is basically almost becomes part of ourselves, like on the cell level, on the molecular level.
I find that hard to accept, that it's biological, but I do believe that there exists the idea of narrative identity. That's where I would place it. So narrative identity is, it's actually what writers know, but what social scientists have decided to put into the language of social science. But essentially the idea of narrative identity is that we all grow up with one, and that narrative identity is, and this is closely linked to resilience, that narrative identity is created, first of all, by the stories your parents tell you, or the people who bring you up when you're a kid. Those may be fairy stories or fables, but they may also be family stories. When you were 3, you did this, or how your parents met. So there's a certain number of stories that circulate round us when we're little. And then, as you get older, you get the stories from the wider culture. Yeah. And it may be what we call the master narrative of how that culture sees itself. So in Britain, it would almost always be, that kind of empire story. But also, it's everything. It's what movies are around at that time. It's the TV shows. But through all of it is being given a sort of, you're building a narrative web out of all of this, and many of those ideas are probably replicating themselves, right, over and over again. And then around the point when you are 18 or 19, which is when narrative identity coalesces, when you're about 18 or 19, you begin to accept or reject certain things. Like you decide, no, that doesn't fit, all right? You have your own experience and your own ability to think, you may apply lateral thinking to it, critical thinking to it, but at some point you accept and reject certain ideas, and most of that happens in your late teens. And of course you can go on doing it, and actually when they say that narrative identity changes most again, it's actually near your dying years. That's when you start rehearsing and rewriting your life based on, you're on your way out. Yeah, exactly. Which is why so many books are about people dying, people telling their story. So it happens at 2 different points in life, but critically it happens when you're very little. So I think that mirrors cellular memory. That's what I would call it. And I think it happens in a diffuse way that we don't necessarily understand. Well, we can't necessarily separate out all the elements. So perhaps it feels like it's something innate, but actually it's something that's received. So I think there's just no way. I think it's inescapable, and because it's so much an inherent part of you, that with my son, I don't, he's only 9. I don't give him the whole story, because there are parts of it he wouldn't understand and parts of it that would be difficult for him. But I genuinely believe that just through the fact that I'm his mother, and that the way in which I relate aspects of my life, his life, our life together, he is getting that is beginning to systemically penetrate him. Even if I wanted it to be different, it does.
I have a question. So this question may be self-explanatory, but you, in your book, The Hired Man, you didn't argument either the size, Croatian nor Serbian, which, so you describe it objectively, but there are some authors, for example, Peter Handke, he also has no relations to the Balkan region, but he chose the Serbian side and argumented it in his works, and it made me wonder why didn't you argument either of the sides, but said the singer in Croatia.
Well, I deliberately never said Serbian or Croatian in the book because I wanted you to look at the actions of the characters. And because I think generally most motivations are personal. Most of the reasons we're motivated to do things are personal. So one of the places that the idea of the hired man came out of many places, right? You know, the empty house, you know, having written about the war in Sierra Leone. But one of the places it came out of was realizing how many crimes were committed under the cover of war. So what had happened to some friends of my mother, my stepmother in Sierra Leone, was 2 friends of hers were killed during the invasion of a town in the north. And you know, even in the chaos of war, these killings seemed peculiar because there were no other signs of, you know, nothing in that. You know, I mean, there was still a lot of looting going on and everything else, but there was the context seemed odd, right? You know, the house wasn't really kind of, that area of the town hadn't really been overrun, the house wasn't really damaged or destroyed, and yet these 2 elderly people had been killed. And it turned out that it was a student. The woman was a professor, and she had had a run-in with a student to whom she'd given a bad grade. And when the town was overrun by the rebel soldiers, he went to her house and killed her in an act of revenge. So this came up over and over again, that the war was used as cover, and that people's motivations were, on the whole, personal, not political, not big P political, right? And then I spent, around about the same time, the French government, for the first time, decided to publish the letters, the denunciations. Do you know about these? So there were letters sent to the occupying German Nazi forces during the war, and they were from French people, and they were denunciations of other French people whom they accused of being fighting for the resistance. And when and the French government sat on these letters for ages because they were so shameful and so potentially inflammatory. But eventually these letters came out. And what they showed was that the arguments were just over someone's field, somebody's husband, somebody's wife, some debt that was owed, that it was all taking place on a personal level. Right? It was not taking place on a big political level at all. So, you know, and that's pretty much how I saw the war in Sierra Leone. It was very much personal level, a lot of it. There were political conditions that allowed it to happen. But what motivated individual actors was almost always personal. It wasn't some huge ideology or some big motivating political factor. So I wanted all of that stripped out of The Hired Man, and I just wanted to look at one town and what happened in one town at one time, and how the people in that town, you know, how they factionalized, even though they hadn't been like that before. How factions were created.
Any more questions? Well,
I'd like to ask a question, actually.
Okay.
How many of you read The Hired Man? Oh, so few.
Yeah.
And how did you get it? Did it here, or you got it online?
No, Diana told me about it, so it was very much actually.
Oh, how interesting. Because it was never translated into Croatian for reasons, you know, mostly I think just to do with the economics and, you know, sales and things that go on in other places. But it was when I would give readings from it in London, a lot of Croatians attended those readings and bought copies of the book. And this is my first opportunity to come to this country. And actually, I was invited a couple of times, but things didn't work out. Well, you've been asking me for 5 years. You know, I mean, I now teach, and I'm stuck with teaching the academic timetable, and you know, the timing never worked out. But it's been really good to be able to come here and have this conversation. And I really appreciate you all turning up tonight and asking your questions and listening to me.
Well, on this note, I can only thank you, and thank you all for coming. And please, unfortunately we can't sell them now because we have 2 copies, but Sreća will be available next week at Interliber, and you can buy them there. And those of you who want to read in English, I mean, there's always Amazon. What can I say?
Yeah, I know.
Aminatta, thank you very much, and thank you.